I was a little girl, I spent nearly every weekend at my grandmother's house. My grandmother was a country girl. She lived her entire life in Indiana. Mostly she was a mom, a wife, a sister, a friend, and eventually she was a grandmother. What people remember most about her, and certainly what I remember most, is that she was genuinely and profoundly happy. You might be wondering what this has to do with poetry. So writing poetry is not always a process that requires significant research. Poetry writing is usually a highly creative process, and typically it's driven by inspiration and emotion. But to study poetry as a Master's of Fine Arts student means to learn about the art in a more specific, a more scientific way. We look at issues like purpose and audience and literary devices. We look at what makes a good poem good, and where in the world of poetry does a particular poem or a particular poet make the most impact. This kind of study of poetry isn't necessarily everyone's cup of tea, but I really enjoy this deliberate and analytical approach to how a poem functions. I like the challenge of it. And the most challenging thing, I think, about writing poetry is acknowledging that reading is a two-person job. The writer might attempt to make meaning and pass that to the reader. But without the reader and his or her tastes, and interests, and prior experiences, it just can't be done. So to fully study how a poem functions, one has to study how the poem is received. This is where my project began. I realized that in order to understand what makes my poems good, I need to better understand my potential readers. I need to understand their struggles, their passions, and I need to figure out why I write poetry and how I connect with my readers. So I guess let's start with who I am. My name is Sara Baxter. I am a second-year grad student in the Creative Writing MFA program at Miami University. Since my grandmother's interpersonal relationships have so profoundly affected me, I decided that the best place to start my research was with personal communication. So I scoured the internet for old handwritten letters, notes, postcards, and greeting cards. And as I read them, I absolutely fell in love with the dialect, some that I recognized and some that was entirely new to me. I began to notice that there was a deep sincerity in these writings. It was so unlike the media that we get bombarded with every single day. The emails, the social media posts, internet articles. The language in these letters was different, I think because the intent was different. These people who were mostly mid-century rural American women, they weren't trying to sell anything, and they weren't trying to appeal to someone they've never met. They were just trying to reconnect or to maintain a connection with someone that they actually cared for. Sometimes it was a mom writing to her adult daughter, or it was an aunt wishing a happy birthday to her little nephew. But what these letters all seemed to have in common was that they expressed love. And the writers who wrote them, they missed their loved ones. They worried for them. They wished the best for them. They longed for them to write back. But I'm not just a student, I'm also a poet, and I have a deep love for words. I quickly became fascinated with the language that was used in these letters, and I wanted to play with it in my own creative work. And at the same time that I began this project, I was just then discovering the genre of found poetry. And I should pause here and explain what I mean by found poetry. So found poetry is similar to the collage in visual arts. Instead of paints, for example, the artist uses objects that have already been crafted for another purpose. So I'm thinking of bottle caps, magazine clippings, buttons. Like collage art, found poetry uses text from outside sources to create a new work of art. So as I worked with this found language, I really wanted my poems to reflect the lived experiences and interests that were being expressed in the letters. Although I was creating fictional characters and fictional situations, I was writing about real people. My process varied from poem to poem. And sometimes I would transcribe the poems and use an online generator to randomize the words. Then I'd search for a poem within the randomized text. Sometimes I would keep the letters intact and find the poems inside those letters, keeping the original order of the source text. And sometimes I would use a similar process, but I would keep the letter as I found it, using photo editing software to hide certain parts of the text in order to reveal the poem, which is typically called erasure poetry. Regardless of the process I used, though, I rarely left even the smallest phrases from the original text intact. But that rich dialect and the thematic underpinnings of these letters always came through in the resulting poems that I wrote. As I became more and more familiar with the theme of my project, I started to expand the scope of my study to include other materials that would have influenced Midwestern life in the past 80 or so years. I brought new materials into my work like World War II Army letters from Army nurses, Dear Abby articles from old newspapers, old copies of Farmer's Almanac, and Reader's Digest, which is something that my grandmother subscribed to religiously. So I'm going to end this by reading one of my favorite poems that I've written for this project so far. Give me a wedding on the Pacific Ocean. History regard me from my French carpet, my lovely paper walls, having walked to the plenty city, breathed along the shops around Amsterdam. Come, calendar fun, I intend to be alive. Marry me to a spiral staircase. Top off in sunny Hawaii. When clock hope tells us it's Sunday, rest your ass at mass, king of flowers. You have been petty. Had a rich woman, had a pretty girl, had a young, delightful lover. Beautiful as we are, between us, all sure be trouble. And when the stars for once are here, we'll spend a week in heaven. The view is beautiful. Then break in for a dip in the world like tourists, with small hope, prison weary. God keep us lonesome and hard.